was the last slide, because we talked about how the study of consciousness was left to the domain of philosophers for a long time. But Francis Crick, when he got bored with the DNA research, he said, "I'm going to do neuroscience." And like a lot of Brits, he moved to with higher salaries and better weather to San Diego, and he started work on neuroscience. And he said, "Okay, well, let's tackle the problem. Let's find out one at a time and take the simplest neuroscience problem called seeing or vision." And so let's plot the neural correlates of consciousness. And he teamed up with a guy who is a German neuroscientist named Christoph, and they worked on the neural correlates of consciousness. So this was their groundbreaking paper that came out sometime in '95, type. So this was Crick and Koch. So that was the paper that got a lot of neurologists or neuroscientists interested in consciousness. So this was an astonishing hypothesis, and like a lot of Nobel laureates, he had written a book also, which was the astonishing hypothesis. And so this was the start of neuroscience. So no wonder none of us studied too much in medical school, because it was considered a career-ending move. Okay, so now I think I'm trying to see if I can revise all the stuff we talked about. Like last time, because brain and neurons. Right now, there's a whole new discipline that some of you may be aware called systems biology, or I'm sure the business people know it's called systems thinking. So this is how it is interpreted. What did we talk about? Like we talked about the knowledge of self as to how we identify, because a baby doesn't have a whole lot of sense of self. By the time he or she gets 3 years old, then he gets, because the baby is basically, it's like aware of the basic necessities: pain, wetness, and hunger. So but by the time 1.5, you could see that. We remember the video of the little kid putting blocks on top, so they had the innate sense of orientation, or some type of a physics orientation, or trying to help out the older guy who could not open the cupboard. We remember those videos. Those was amazing how this little kid just goes, "Let me open the door for you, you big guy." And that was just, I would have blew my mind as to how it was, that thing. So that was, we talked about that. And so basically with consciousness, we are looking at inside at ourselves, introspection. And the big difference between the philosophers and neists, like, are you the subject or the object? Are you studying all the organ structures objectively, or you're the subject? So that is where the big controversy starts. And now the big thing is with the advent of computer scientists getting involved, and after 1950s, the big thing is like everything, the basis is information. And this is interesting that a couple of days ago, I read a history of computer science, and this goes back to punch card. Now, punch card goes back to the discovery of looms in 1800, because city in France was big on making silk. So that is where first, forget the name, Jacques. I'm sorry, I don't remember, forget his last name. But he's the first one who made punch card for looms. And so that was the start of, yeah, that just blew my mind. That like, and they reduced the time for weaving a brocade of silk from like taking a whole week to almost any design you can interpret. You can, just revolutionize, silk printing type thing. So that was the start of punch card. And it just, was mind boggling as to how it was. So since then, information theory has become big. And what we are doing is brain is inside a skull, doesn't have, it's enclosed in a dark space. So we're getting the input from outside, from the senses. Okay. But based on that, we are forming what we call mental states. When you see something, obviously, like, and to use, not to quote the famous philosopher Daniel Dennett, we are feeling like a Cartesian theater, like a window within the window. So you're just creating an image inside your brain, and you're trying to make sense out of it. But unfortunately, there is a difference in the processing power that will be apparent in next slide. So you're getting the input, and then all these things are put together in something called a workspace. It's like a desk where all this information something from hearing. It's like a very noisy environment, and you're trying to form patterns and making some sense out of it. Okay, and this is basically, intelligence is kind of, and that's how intelligence arises. I had the definition of intelligence earlier as to how do things, awareness of self and others, and trying to do the task efficiently to your benefit of survival and interpreting the world as we know it. So that's basically what we're talking about. And that almost all this information forms some type of a belief in your mind. It creates desire, and that makes you act, type of thing. So again, so we say, oh, there's a belief, there's a fruit on the tree. I want it. So that's where you do the action. So that is basically what we talked about last time, called theory of mind. Okay. And this is, again, obviously, the underneath of all this is evolution, evolution, and evolution. Like all this is like brain, as we talked about in some of the earlier things. It's like things are superimposed one upon another, because the primitive brain, the so-called medulla and pons, which keeps you alive and tells you that, oh, you're hungry, or you're fight and flight, the 4F response we talked about. On top of it, cortex and other interpretive things about getting along with other people has been superimposed. So its evolution is at the cornerstone of all the things, Okay, and obviously, that not just the Darwinian evolution, but the neo-Darwin evolution, or we can say like based on DNA and atoms. So, okay, so we can just say again, quote, that it's all physics all the way down. It's turtles all the way, or you can say atoms and quarks are underway. All this requires energy, and obviously, that's now we are getting energy, like it is like basically we're getting free lunch from photosynthesis and eating plants, and so that's and underneath all the things we talked about, bioelectricity and chemical messages. We already mentioned about cables and soup, just to refresh your memory. And body tries to maintain homeostasis because it doesn't like any surprises. You maintain status quo, basically, type of thing. Now, this was, for change, I went to Encyclopedia Britannica, and this was mind-boggling. You can just see that, all the processing and other stuff, for like reading, interpreting, like brain processing is 50, and obviously information is 1 and 0 bits. That's how the computer guys define things. And okay, so the processing power is rather slow, but look at the transmission rate of senses. Now, obviously, I have only one reference for this is Encyclopedia Britannica, but look and see how much input bits we are getting from just seeing, or from skin, from ears. I mean, this was mind-boggling, and I haven't had time to look more into this, but this was mind-boggling. Yes, so that's how brain has to make up things. Like the solution for this, because we're getting massive amount of information from outside, but the brain is kind of, so what does the brain do? Okay, puts a brake on it, like a half a second delay. We talked about the Benjamin Libet experiment, that the brain is already deciding and finally decides to act. So it takes its own time to make sense out of all this information that's pouring in, type of thing. And the solution to the second problem is there are 100 billion cells which are all connected with each other. So finally they get together, and there's a lot of mess going on. And we try to, so that's how it's a top-down interpretation, not just like a pinhole camera where the information is coming. And so now I have to correct myself that I said, okay, well, I mean, the consciousness and awareness of self occurs at 1 to 1.5 years of age. But just a couple of days ago, there was a report from Melbourne, Australia, that under anesthesia, even fetus has some type of consciousness that is developing. But I have to read the whole thing in more details to make more out of it. But that's the latest things about when consciousness evolves. Okay, this is again, just for sake of mentioning, we'll say that there is like a philosopher named Searle had this so-called Chinese room experiment as to, you can read in the notes type of thing, like this is like a lot of intellectual exercise as to how even without understanding a word of Chinese, you can pass the Turing test. So what does it really mean about consciousness? So this was some type of philosophical argument that is well known if you read about philosophy of consciousness, but I will just gloss over that for sake of time. Okay. Now, this is I think Dave Smolinski, I don't know if he's here or not, but
So this is really a remarkable body of work that has produced the first whole brain cell atlases of the human and non-human primate brain. It's also really started to illustrate some of the specific specializations of the human brain compared to those of other species. I think understanding the human-specific features is important, principally because most diseases of the human brain are only seen in human. We need to understand the specifics of the human brain if we hope to understand human diseases. The brain is extremely complex from a cellular perspective, and this is really the first description of just how complex it is. We define over 3,000 kinds of cells in the adult human brain, and this is not comprehensive. This is a first draft version of this. And furthermore, where that complexity is somewhat unexpected. Much of the research in the field focuses on the neocortex, the outer shell of the cortex, as being responsible for our higher cognitive functions. This must be where the complexity is. Well, that turns out not to be true. It turns out that much of the complexity is actually in deeper, older evolutionary structures. And so we haven't had access to understanding that complexity, and now we're starting to get a map of this. So what's happened in this package is moving from prior studies that have looked at single brain regions to start to make an atlas of the entire brain and to compare this across species. So I think a really key thing to highlight is that this work has been dramatically accelerated through the support of the NIH Brain Initiative, through their cell census efforts, which are now called the Cell Atlas efforts. They've really moved from trying to develop technologies first that can be used to really understand the cellular and molecular organization of the brain to the scale up. Something that really enabled this is a very parallel set of work between the mouse and larger, more complex brains, where the mouse presents a tractable model system where these methods can be developed and very quickly then transition to work in other places with some technological tweaks. So these two things sort of working in parallel have allowed us to move from methods to model systems to human very quickly. That's now enabled actually the next phase. This is really moving into very comprehensive coverage of the human and non-human primate brain. And this next phase, I think, really is akin to the Human Genome Project. You know, we're trying to get a comprehensive characterization of the basic components of the nervous system.
okay. Now, just to give a background, this was a paper that just came out about this brain atlas. This was a paper that was about 25 papers that were published in Science, Nature, and Science Advances at the same time within last 2 weeks. So they obviously the papers are very complicated and other stuff, and I shan't bore you with this, but this was the most understandable video from Allen Institute. Allen Institute is in Seattle, and that was funded by Paul Allen, one of the Microsoft uh, who is who. And so this is where Christoph Koch, who I talked about, he works at the Allen Institute in Seattle. And so that's just, how the technology has funded this thing along with. And this, again, this contrasts with the so-called Blue Plane project that was started in Europe. They spent almost like $1 billion trying to, and after spending $1 billion, they had been able to match about like a 1-inch area of mouse brain, after spending. So how much they have gained from it, so that really didn't pan out. The European Union had funded this thing, and this has been going on since the 90s. But this seems like that we are finally people on the right track. And now this may change. He talks about the mouse, but these mice are genetically bred. They're not really like a mouse. They're like a mouse object. But the organoids that I'll talk about at the end of the class, hopefully, as if time permits, that is going to be the new big thing, because you can really create human cells and study the organoids, and that may change the whole science behind it. Okay, and now this is just to get out of the way. I'll just mention this, and this was a big controversy that has been going on for the last 30 years. There is an Australian philosopher named David Chalmers had said about the so-called heart problems, the qualia of the sense of perception, like the taste of the apple or the redness of the red type of thing. And that has been the big vote about being the subjective feeling as to what it feels like to be, and it goes back to the earlier paper that I'd mentioned about Nagel, which I'd written in the 70s about what does it feel like to be a man. So this is, this has been the problem in study of consciousness, between qualia of the subjective sensation of feeling as they're getting the first-hand experience versus actually the neural coordinates. So the difference comes from between the subjective and the objective sense. Okay, now then there are various theories type of thing, and this goes down. The biggest thing is like I talked about the Bayesian inference, and just to take you back to your high school math, this is the probability equation that was coined by, this obviously this is a very simplified version of it about Bayes. This was like in the 19th century, and this is so the brain does what is called Bayesian interference, and he's one of the respected researcher at University of Sussex, and I'll just see if I can go to the right spot and just. Okay, obviously it's a long video that I think I wanted to go to about 20 minutes and 20.
The brain's best guess about the causes of sensory inputs. And the basic idea is again quite simple. The brain is locked inside its bony skull at home and has very indirect access to the external world. All it receives are ambiguous and noisy sensory signals, which are highly indirectly related to this external world of objects and so on, if there is an external world of objects out there at all. Don't know about that. Perception in this view is by necessity a process of inference in which the brain interprets these ambiguous and noisy sensory signals with respect to some prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is. And this forms the brain's best guess of the causes of the sensory signals that are impacting our sensory surfaces all the time. What we see is the brain's best guess of what's out there. I want to give you a couple of examples that illustrate this process. It's quite easy to do in a way. This first.
Okay, I think we have shown all of this. So let me just jump to, for sake of time, obviously I can't show 1 hour worth of video, but I think the next part that I wanted to go to was, say, around like 43 minutes. Apologize because there is no way I can show the whole video type of thing. So, okay, let's do this.
Self. This is where this only until now we don't have to worry about the concept of I, but when we get to the narrative self, there is now an I. There is a continuity of self-experience from hour to hour, from day to day, from month to month, and from year to year that you associate a name with and a particular set of autobiographical memories. And finally, there's a social self. The way I experience being me is partly dependent on the way I perceive you as perceiving me. I'm just going to talk in the minutes that remain about the bodily self. This is something we're working on quite a lot in Sussex. The experience of identifying with and owning a particular body. And the basic idea I want to convey is, again, very simple. It's just that we should think of our experience of body ownership in the same way that we think about our experience of other things as well. That's it.
Okay, so I think that was just, he gets the point. So this basically goes down to the William James in the stream of consciousness, how everything is continuous. Or what Oliver Sacks, the great neuroscientist, talks about like the mind's eye, so to speak. So this is, so the interconnectedness. Now let's just jump to one more point, and then I'll move forward. It was about somewhere along like 52. Okay.
Should be thought of as an experiment designed to test whether we've understood correctly the invariant relations of the phenomena before us. Richard Gregory much later said something similar when he talked about perception as hypothesis testing. The point of this is that we make eye movements and other kinds of movements to understand what the world is like, that in fact there is a tomato there, for instance. But there's another way to think.
Okay, so you get the general idea, but it's a very well-framed video. This was done at the Royal Institute, as you can see from the sides, and these are some excellent talks that for those of you who are more curious, I'll be glad to send this out, the links.
About active inference, which is that when we minimize prediction error, what we're actually doing is controlling a sensory variable. We're preventing it from changing.
Oh, sorry, I should be able to stop it.
The environment.
Pause. Okay, now I can go forward. Otherwise,
account for the subjective.
Okay. Now,
the hard problem of consciousness.
Okay. I think let's just jump over. I think that this is a talk by David Chalmers. Again, it's like he mostly elaborates the point about the so-called heart problem. And And I really don't exactly care for what the whole stuff is all about. And I think it's a much ado over nothing type of thing. So okay, and then goes back to the, much to the chagrin of Freud haters. We just have this thing that this was the Freud's earlier idea. But to give him his credit, he did start out as a neuroscientist basically. So talks about the conscious and unconscious type thing, and it goes back to again, the Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas, and there is perhaps something like that. There was an interesting story in one of the books that about, there are people who are it's really hard to tell sex in chickens. Okay, I've never tried to guess sex of a chicken, but there you have it. But people who are working in the factories or assembly line, like as to say which one you want to them to be around, which one you want to get rid of them, because once the males are not that useful for people who are in the industrial farms. So, but there are people who have this innate sense that somehow they can tell the sex of a chicken, just subconsciously, basically, type of thing, as to how their inner mind works, which for you and I would be hard, but those who have trained their body type of thing, it has something to do with hitting the baseball. Okay, when the baseball is coming, by the time, as to how the batter just knows. And the similarly story that goes back to the Second World War type of thing, as to during the Battle of Britain, there are some people who had trained, says, oh yeah, this is Spitfire, no, this is Messerschmitt. And they were spot on, because it was really hard to tell as to who is coming and whether to get the anti-aircraft defenses activated or not. But so that was interesting how during World War II, the unconscious or subconscious, whatever you want to call it. And this again, so this is again goes back to that. There may be more to it than we realize, that a lot of the decision is done. Consciousness is like, we could almost do without consciousness, because the brain decides 80% of the work without really even, in the background, it just goes on, type of thing. And this is again just to show as to we mentioned a little bit about dreams. And, obviously the three famous dreams that people talk about is to, like, obviously John, the chemists know about the, Mendeleev dreams about the periodic table, or the other famous dreams, like the organic chemists know about Kekula's dream about the benzene ring. But in neuroscience, there was this famous dream that we talked about, a guy named Otto Loewy, okay? And he had the dream about the experiment of the vagus nerve, as to how to do the experiment about discovering the acetylcholine chemical, as to how they were trying to separate. Remember we talked earlier about the cables versus soup. So that's where he denervated the thing, took the liquid from the donor heart, added fluid to the recipient heart. Sure enough, the heart slowed down. So it proved, that there was chemical messaging. So this just goes to, so this was, he had a dream first night, and then he kind of wrote it down and went and did the experiment. So there was something about how, and it happens many times, that during dream you come up with the solution type of thing. So that's why, your brain is not at rest when you're sleeping. It's just working, so to speak, trying to, and again, there's a lot of things. I mentioned a guy named, a South African neuropsychologist named Mark Soames. So he has written a lot about that dreams are away, and we talked about the stimulation of dopamine versus GABA receptors between sleep and REM sleep. So, but this just goes, and this again traces for historical purposes the research that went on in neuroscience about, a lot of them are, I think all three of them are Englishmen type of thing, and I think one German thrown in for, and these are all Nobel laureates, eventually. But that's again, so this talks about the dreams, and Freud about predicting processes. Okay, so, and again, the recent idea has been again reawakened by an English neuroscientist / philosopher named Andy Clark, about predictive processing as a top-down processes. And so this is one of his models about predictive processing that takes place, distinction between perception and actions. Okay, so again, now it goes down to some of the earlier things, but now in Wisconsin, there's a psychologist, named Richie Davidson, who has been studying the Tibetan monks who are really expert, deep meditators, and he's been bringing them to Wisconsin and putting them into fMRI machine for since I should say the mid 80s, and how their mind works as to the mind, the usefulness of mind body, putting the philosophical and religious thinking on a very organic and a solid foundational basis. So they've been doing a lot of research. And I think I may be repeating myself, but there's a Frenchman named Matthew Ricard, who, those who have some philosophical Buddhist background, he's the son of a physicist, and he's a physicist himself. And he's been an ordained monk living with Dalai Lama for the last 20 years. And, so and he's been coming to Wisconsin for like 20 years. And their fMRI is totally different when they meditate compassion. And so this, again, goes to organic basis. Now, when this question was posed to Dalai Lama, basically, but he turned the question around. And he just said, okay, it is the mind that modifies the brain. So it was really, again, so he was not a science denier, but again, at the same time, he stayed true to his guns type of thing. So, and so there are a predominance, and along with this, fMRI, has nice, pretty images, but localizing the ink is very hard. So at the same time, they did electroencephalogram, which can pinpoint the areas. They showed that in EEG also, the so-called theta waves, were predominant during the meditation. And that's almost what you see in sleep. So, but at the same time, these people were not sleeping, so this was an interesting research that Richie Davidson has been doing for a number of years, and he's a psychologist by training. And you can see these images you don't have to be a neuroscientist to see how they're color-coded, how the brain is active versus the brain is calm type of thing. And this is well known. This is basically common sense about, how the level of consciousness, wakefulness versus content of the consciousness. So again, this is in coma. Obviously, both are at the lower end of the graph, while the REM sleep, leg syndrome, and when you're conscious, drowsy light. So these are very, very apparent type of thing. And it's very difficult, again, to decide, because for those of us who have worked in the hospitals, I know recovery after a cardiac arrest, it's really a challenge to see whether who's going to wake up and who's not going to wake up. Okay, one hates to tell the stories, but I can tell you about my story. I think we had a guy who had outside the hospital cardiac arrest, and I guess, we usually wait for 48 hours to see if he's going to wake up before so-called pull the plug, type of thing. But my friend who's a neurologist, he had looked at the EEG, on the second day, and before seeing the patient, the family was in the waiting room, so he decided, oh, it looks pretty hopeless, type of thing based on the EEG. And the family said, wait, doctor, have you seen the patient today? So no, I'm going in there. And the guy was awake and was showing response. So it just goes to show that even EEG is not 100% by any means, So at the same time, I had a patient with just, I don't know what I can do differently type of thing, as to this guy had a witness cardiac arrest. Okay. And, the squad was there and he arrested in front of him. We resuscitated him successfully and he was brought to the hospital, did studies, and he needed bypass surgery. So I called the neurologist, said, should we do surgery or not? They says, yeah, if anybody's going to wake up, this guy should. Okay. So we sent him to bypass surgery. 7 days later, never woke up. And I still don't understand what we could have done differently type of thing, in good faith. And so this just boils down to the, Kevin, I don't know if Kevin is here or not, but he and I took a class on ethics, but this just boils down as to how, in medicine, the decision-making can go, can fly in your face type thing. And I still remember it as long as I live. I'll remember these two cases as to how, okay. And again, this is now one thing we didn't talk about is philosophy of feelings, and as to how there, like along with Mark Solms, there is a San Diego-based neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio. And earlier, for those of you who are, more observant, remember the book that we talked about, Descartes' Error. This is a book by Antonio Damasio. And he also had a book about, looking for Spinoza, which is on my shelf, that thing. So, but he talks about the role of emotions and feelings as to how, we may have evolved, starting from bottom downwards, the proto self, like even a little amoeba or a cell, has some type of consciousness. It looks for, that's a difference, again, between living and dead type thing. It survives type of thing. And again, the geneticists know that the lac operon, like how, a little E. coli changes its metabolism based on availability of type of sugar that is available between lactose and glucose. So you can just say that it may have some type of a decision making or either a chemical thing, but it doesn't have a brain, but still knows for survival that yes, we should turn on this particular gene. So it boils down to, and so again, then it goes down to awareness of fish. And again, it goes down to how electricity evolved in eels, as to electric eel, that even the Greek and Roman times, you're aware that yes, there is need for electricity. And that was the starting point of research of electricity and involved, in the start of that's how we discovered, and the experiments we talked about Golgi and Volta, and then further evolutionary scales. And you can see how the self-recognition became available in chimpanzees and other mammals, dolphins. And obviously, even the more and more data is coming around, the Neanderthals obviously had intelligence as much as human beings, as modern Homo sapiens rather, so, and they buried their dead and they had, grief, and whether they had language or not, obviously we don't have any recordings, so we can't tell, but obviously they had some type of communication skills available. So we're becoming available. That's how the consciousness may have evolved. Again, when it comes down to theories of consciousness, just do not waste your time on this, because the experts cannot agree. The reason why there are 20 of them, because nobody can agree on what this is, so, and why so many. And I think that's a lot of mental energy that is being lost at thoughts about consciousness. And this is again how the whole thing is like, and there is a big controversy that just again occurred two weeks ago, and this was the theory that is called, this is Christoph Koch, by the way, and I guess he must be colorblind, the way he dresses, type thing. I've never seen a lecturer with flaming red pants and a blue hat type thing, but that's Christoph Koch, and he speaks with a solid German accent, type thing. So, and this was his book about the so-called integrated information theory. And this has been okay, I'm not going to play his video, but this again, just because of sake of time, and I think, he's a little hard to understand. This was again a big news item just within last 2 weeks. They about 100, and I may have mentioned this earlier, but just this is the appropriate time to repeat myself, that the integrated information theory was labeled as pseudoscience by 120 scientists, which was really little off the top, because the people who signed were, a lot of them were philosophers, a lot of them were, and the part of it is it's not testable. It goes down to, because in science, any theory should be testable type of thing, and so that's why they was accused as being pseudoscience, which, because again, what it does is instead of looking at the brain itself, it goes from consciousness itself and tries to find the neural correlates of it. So they are turning the whole theory backwards. So that's why they were labeled as. But I know it was one of, and between the David Chambers and Christoph Koch had 20 years ago, they had a bet as to in 25 years we'll be able to find the cause of consciousness, the organic, the anatomical basis of consciousness. But we haven't come much further, as you remember from Matthew Kolb's book. So finally, the Christoph Koch, he paid up the bet. There was a bet similarly in physics also between, Stephen Hawking and another physicist at Stanford. But that's why I'm digressing. So, but this is a video that basically outlines about.
Hello everyone. My name is visual data is processed and influence our behavior, our perception, and the neural basis of our thought. The problem here is how this happens mechanistically. It's considered easy because it's a logical consequence of mechanisms in the brain, and given enough time and technological advancement, we can peer ever deeper into the neural mechanisms of the brain to better understand them. Solving the easy problem results in identifying the neural correlates of consciousness. That is, as Seth and Bain put it, the minimal set of neural events jointly sufficient for a conscious state. However, neural correlates of consciousness are not sufficient to solve the hard problem. The hard problem is concerned with these sorts of questions. Why do things feel the way they do? Is what one person feels the same as another? And if the mechanisms are the same, why can things feel different to different people? Seth and Bain describe how we can understand the hard problem as the experimental dimensions of consciousness. And at the moment, there seems to be no prospect of a fully reductive explanation of experience in physical or functional terms, which Seth and Bain describe as the explanatory gap. To close this gap, we would need to have a theory of consciousness in hand that either aims to address the hard problem directly or justifiably sidesteps it entirely. Having an empirically validated theory of consciousness, as Seth and Bain say, should be the goal of all consciousness science. The heart of the problem of consciousness is experience and subjectivity. There is something it is like for an organism to be conscious, and what it is like.
Okay, so I think
Hello, everyone.
we have already
My
talked
name is
enough
Callum,
about it,
and
so
today
I
I'll
think
be-
we will skip this because we don't have enough time left, because this was originally going to be a 6 week talk, but so I think okay, now we'll go down to where the second part of the talk is going to be intelligence. So we'll have a few slides about intelligence, type thing. So and then this goes back to the early evolutionary scale before Homo sapiens came on the earth. They were like Homo habilis. And this basically is the guy who was handy with tools, So and then later on, Homo erectus and the other evolutionary ladders that have disappeared, they had some type of intelligence because they knew how to use tool and survive, even though they were not physically. So they were able to make their way out of African savannas. And then later on, with the development of language, which we talked about, this was there even in Neanderthals, okay, and whether this was there in other human evolutionary traits which have disappeared. But again, we talked about the development of language. It goes back probably a lot longer than we thought. It was not just 20 to 30,000 years ago, but explosion type of thing. But it was like a mimetic or imiting language, like, okay, basically, ouch, or whatever words happened. So that's how language may have evolved. And finally, with the availability of more calories, our cortex expanded dramatically, as I showed you in the slides of evolution. And so that, that just, we took off and really, just by, and initially just we walked, and by 60 or 70,000 years, humans had made all the way from Africa to Australia. Okay, so this is, again, whether eating mushrooms had anything to do with our brain or not, that's, I think, probably Nick would enjoy hearing about that, because obviously by that time, the trees in Africa savanna had disappeared, and probably there was a lot of mushrooms. So whether the mushrooms improved our thinking or not, that's just an interesting guess type of thing. So, okay, but again, the cooking and availability of more calories, had a lot to do with expanding our intelligence, that thing. And I thought this was an interesting slide, which is a short one. I'll show it to you. Sorry, I didn't write down the name of this little tiny organism. It's which, like how with things, divides to. So it really has like a lacrimaria. So hunts down another cell, and it's like, so this is, and I had mentioned that in the earlier. This is Michael Levine is a cutting edge researcher at Tufts University. He does a lot of work on bioelectricity, and when that's how collective intelligence may have evolved, with on an evolutionary basis. So this is one of his clips from one of his video. It's like and here's like at least 50 or 100 YouTube video about collective intelligence using bioelectricity, and is big into using regenerative medicine that we talked about. And they're trying to devise something called, we've heard of pharmaceuticals. They're developing chemicals which are called electroceuticals. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Okay, where you can just alter the ion channels that transmit signal inside the individual neurons. So that's a new braving words. And they have done some experiments which almost Frankensteinian or cutting edge, And so they like putting an eye on the leg of an animal, or doing, if I recall, showed a slide of planaria, which has a survival ability. If you cut off the head, it will grow another head. Okay, and if you put those signals in the other part, it can even grow two heads. So it's really almost like a Frankensteinian type of research. So if you have interest and time, okay, and weird synapses like I do, you can watch this video type thing. So, okay, now this is a book that read by a German researcher. You know, it compares the computer neural networks as to the human neural network. So how does a neural network become a brain? And the picture on the left is, you know, the nerve cells in the pyramidal tract in a slice of a brain, the electron microscope. You can see how the two scientific disciplines. And the next and the slide on the right side is, I'll leave it to Bruce as to how the neural networks operate. So how the information gets transmitted type of thing, you know, basically. So, and there are billions of neurons that we talked about, you know, like 8, and then they have, each of them have like close to 10,000 connections. So, you know, it's an amazingly complicated cell. And so this is, you know, that's why the connectivity is, you know, we can say it may be random, and then eventually, you know, like that, it's like a bunch of people crowded inside a thing, and who's shouting. So it almost reminds you of a stock exchange as to who gets the trade. And again, you know, it is, as we have already talked about in the earlier slide, you may recall, it grows from genes to environment and to the behavior. So it's a complex interplay of various factors that we talked about. Okay. Now this is, again, you know, the cortex, which is, again, you know, the center of intelligence, you know, type of thing, you know. Okay. So we can say, well, we are not unique type of thing. Again, you know, this is a bumblebee. I think somebody had mentioned earlier about a bumblebee waggle dance, you know. And this was one of the first Nobel Prizes that got for ethnobiology, about the tracing of the path of the bees, as to how one bee leaves a track and the other bee follows, and as to how they actually do kind of a geometric calculations. And you have to admire to this was a German researcher who put actually a transporter on top of a bee, okay, and actually plotted the graph as to how far the bee stands and as to how the other bee would, you know, follow the track. So this was how they were, the waggle dance, and one waggle equals 74 meters, you know, basically. So they were able to map out the distance type of thing as to how does that other bee interprets the distance type of thing and how it's connected. And they're able to follow the source of the food type thing again. And in terms of, I may be repeating myself, but there is an example as to how nature and nurture, how the Romanian children who are left without affection, you know, they just were totally at serious neurological and psychological issues, as even after being adopted by a more supporting family. Okay, and again, another example that we talked about earlier, you know, that how monarch butterfly, when it travels from Mexico to northern Canada or northern US, as to how it has gone through 3 generations. And, you know, obviously the ones who made the journey are long gone and dead, but still there is something that happens that they are able to follow and visit the same patch, you know, in Mexico type thing. So 3,000 miles over many generations. So how is the, now obviously the genome does not encode the map type of thing. And so the connectivity is done in 3 dimensions. So that may be the more source of the intelligence type of thing. Okay. And similarly, you know, this is, again, you know, I will leave it to Bruce to talk about the artificial neural networks type of thing. And that's a big fuss that prompted both of us to do the talk. So I won't tread on his that thing, but he'll talk a lot more about it type of thing. So this is just a GIF image for of the neural networks as to how, you know, so it's like, okay. And so, and again, this defines of intelligence goes back to the father of psychology, William James, the ability to reach the same goal by different means, you know. And we talked about, you know, the subject of intelligence. These are some of the slides of Michael Levine that I mentioned earlier. And again, you know, both the modalities of transmission of signal are into play, so-called ion channels, electrical synapses, you know. So this is, you know, the so-called hardware inside, and that generates the neural coordinates as to how the behavior is, it's, you know, reproduced or evolves. Okay, and so there's a lot of exciting work, you know. Now I'll have a few slides about the action potential as to how this thing comes about. Okay. And again, the intelligence, ability to solve complex problems, make decision with outcome benefiting the actor, and is evolved to face survival and reproduction. Ultimately, those are the two goals, which any animal is evolved. That's why the nature doesn't actually care whether you live to be, once you have had reproduce, like this thing. So, and there are again, those of you who are psychology majors or, the social sciences majors, there are so-called many types of intelligence that a guy named Gardner, evolved type thing. So, and this is so-called G factor. So, varieties of, intelligence based on reasoning, working memory. So this is all this the so-called G factor is the key concept type of thing. Okay, and obviously, I'm sure quite a few of you had taken intelligent IQ test in high school or middle school type of thing, and after the publication of the book with the bell curve, it has kind of been gotten a lot of bad publicity, and there are a few isolated researchers who are still working on the field. They're kind of the lone. And just recently, American psychologist named Robert Plomin, and he finally did not get enough funding because he was doing research onto IQ differences between various people, and finally had to, move to UK to do research type of thing. And obviously he's not racist from what I read from his work type of thing. Says yes, there are inheritable differences in intelligence, and for that may be a factor to identify kids who are autistic or have learning disability at a young age and try to help them. So one can say that that is kind of a positive eugenics, but again in the US it has had got the bad publicity type of thing. And I think I did mention this, but just because I thought it was hilarious that in Israel, to donate sperm, one needs an SAT of 700 or above. Okay. Okay. And there was a physicist who has branched into neuroscience, a guy named Stephen Su. It's a Chinese name, I might be mispronouncing it. And he has done a lot of work on what is known as polygenic scores, means doing the human genome analysis and trying to tease out the role of genes in intelligence. So they're able to create something known as a polygenic score. Again, he's not racist by any means. Being Asian, he can't afford to be racist type thing because he faced, he grew up in Iowa, and he says, yeah, he had enough problem of his own growing up in small town Iowa, and obviously, and he had a neighbor who had learning disability, so he has been interested in intelligence field for a long time, and subsequently, so he has started a company to try to identify based on intelligence based on polygenic score. Now, this ties in with in vitro fertilization, because when they induce eggs with in vitro just fertilization, they create as many as 30 embryos. Okay, and can they do polygenic score on those selective embryos and try to pick out the one that has higher chance of intelligence as to give an unfair advantage, as to it becomes a really ethical issue type of thing. So how that will all pan out, that the society will have to decide as to how that information should be used or abused, okay, type thing, because obviously it's a very expensive procedure type of thing. So that is, so it's getting into some of the controversial subject matter that we talked about. Okay, I think we're moving right along type thing. So let's see, what do I have here? So why are we so brainy type thing as to what is the big advantage? I mean, we could have easily survived, type of thing in living in caves. And advantage obviously is the big social need and selective sexual selection, I mean, that's how skinny guys can get married, okay, or Elon Musk can have, 3 wives, type of thing. So it just goes around. So there is definitely, advantage that occurs, and then again, language has a lot to do with it, So a special environment, again, a key to evolutionary process. So that may be, again, so this talks about, the various advantages and various types of intelligence that we talked about. So there is obviously a benefit. That's how we, have developed, because otherwise evolution would have eliminated the need if it didn't have advantages. And again, so obviously we are not a blank slate type of thing we talk about, it's in spite of what Steven Pinker had written. And again, this all the research has been maligned with eugenics, and they in not just the United States, but and I'll leave this or put a shameless promo for my next class of science of race, and we'll have a lot of slides about eugenics all over the world type thing. And again, the twin studies had a lot to do with it, type thing that even identical twins brought up in different environments, had similar IQs. So after a certain age, the influence of nurture kind of withered out. And there was like back in the 30s, I would say the Minnesota twin studies, they've been studying twins for almost 50 to 60 years. So this has a lot to do with a polygenic score. So again, instead of just observational studies, the polygenic score has turned the things upside down type of thing. So and before bell curve, there was a researcher named Jensen in 1969, and he had published a book in the 1969 in Harvard Education Review entitled "How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement?" Okay, and he was just saying about how some of the Head Start program that were designed, did not pan out as much. So again, he emphasized the role of genetic role, and obviously he was almost chased out and lost his funding and lost his this thing. And this was in the heydays of, of the in US type of thing. So again, and this is some of the stats as to how PET scanning and intelligence type of thing. Now, this was interesting data type of thing. This is from a guy named Richard Heyer, who has continued to do research on, wrote just a recent book about him, Neuroscience of Intelligence, okay? And it shows that people who were quote unquote smarter, their brain had less metabolism when they're given tougher problems, So you think obviously when they're given tougher problems, then be working harder, but no, that wasn't the case type of thing. So, okay, so but basically still allows to disappoint you. There are no pills to enhance your function so far. Okay, I think we're coming up to 1 hour. Let me see how far. IQ therefore okay, I just had to put this to for the sake of the two Brits. IQ therefore I'm a Brit, but not that IQ we're talking about, but this IQ. Okay, and so 50 to 80% is inheritance. Now this was just a few days ago, I read a book about evolution of female body. Okay, this is a very scholarly book written by a woman who has a PhD in evolution from Columbia. And I think some of the women may enjoy this because she goes into evolution of breast, uterus, and the female body. And again, with the rise of feminism, we're saying, okay, male and female brains are equal exactly. But alas, the more recent research that there are subtle differences. Girls at identical age are definitely better on verbal skills, while boys are better on spatial skills, I think. So there are differences type of thing. And then again, the difference is widened. So she has a whole chapter on it, but just for sake of time, I'm not going to get into it. But it's a very interesting book type of thing that she talks about the evolution of all organs, because most of the research was done on male rats, because female rats and mice are harder to work with. So a lot of the research that's been done, is like either the studies are done at Veterans Hospital, and women were excluded in a lot of these studies that were done. And now obviously the things are changing. And even the NIH says, well, requires a balanced sampling type of thing. Okay, but that has been a big limitation of a lot of the research that was done. Okay, and this may some of you may already know that, that if you took the SAT or Scholastic Aptitude Test, if you divide your score that you had, if you remember it, what was divided by 10, plus or minus 10, that would be close to your IQ. Okay, so you can just refresh your memory. If you scored 1400 or 1500, then your score is somewhere between 140 and 160 type of thing. So, okay. And again, so there are, and again, as we talked about Gardner, he talks about varieties of IQ, this so-called emotional IQ, social IQ, or adversity IQ. But in general, so that's, and these are some of the graphs as to how this is from the book that I talked about for female evolution. Okay, as to how, we look at the curves, if you know how to, and as to curves are. In girls, the curve is fairly even distribution, and in the boys, the distribution is more at tail end as to see how the graph is right. So you can find out the boys were way off the chart, okay, at the same time, but the girls' spectrum is relatively narrow. So those, so you can just see that there are differences. So amongst the problem with the kids with problems, there were more boys, and both ends there were problems. People were way below the chart versus, so the curve is a lot more, broadened out, as you can see how, so this was overall, and it applies for the science, technology, engineering, math, as to see how the boys were way off the charts, means IQs 200 plus type of thing, and so both ends. So this was an interesting data. This was from her, from the papers that she had alluded to. It was in her index. Okay, I think we're coming up to 11 o'clock, so, and we're just, and again, this talks about what part of the brains are. Okay, and the last slide of the neural roads of intelligence. And again, so the part that is, I think this is the last slide for intelligence about the, and the part that, I'm sorry, the slides are harder to read, but basically this refers to as something called the Pareto frontal integration theory, which talks about, and it basically common sense as to how the intelligence would reside in the more later evaluated part, the parietal region, the frontal region, that is where the state of core intelligence behavior rights. The large scale brain networks collect to other regions and causing rise to, a rise of intelligence as we understand in common sense. So this gives so-called the best answer to the where in the brain the intelligence resides. So that's just the whole point of this thing. Okay, I think we should take a break for a little while and then go over with few more slides. Okay, I will, if you don't mind stopping the recording, and then I'll stop the slides and stick around. It's 11 o'clock and we can restart it. Okay.
Okay.
Now I think, this is obviously, Bruce will talk a lot more about it, but this was interesting that how he was, Alan Turing was a true polymath. He not only just, he's the founder of computer science as we know it, but he also wrote a paper on morphogenesis. So he had, it's just on a sidekick on his free time, he had talked about the biological, beginning of shape as to how, all the disciplines are tied in type of thing. So this was his paper, and this was very cited paper, and this goes back to 1952. And some of the work that I talked about that Michael Levine is doing, the chemical basis of morphogenesis, and this was obviously a respectable paper, type of thing. So it just goes to, and so there are, again, I have a lot of things about the Turing machines and other stuff, but for sake of time, I'm not going to get into it type of thing that, okay. Okay. And again, these are some of the stuff about, I'll just stick to my side about the neural networks as to how this is interesting as to how things are wired up. A single neuron has as many as 53 inputs and 18 output, connected to 74. So you can just see how complex the machinery is type of thing. So it's going to be, hard to reproduce this permutation combination that occurs in human testing. So who knows as to what the limitation may be type of thing, but that's what people are worried about, type thing. And that I'm sure Bruce will address that in the third weeks of his class as to whether we'll be able to reproduce this thing or not. This is just some of the slides when I thought I was just going to do a class by myself. This was the slide that I put, just computer between human brain and computers to see biological, silicon, blah, blah, blah. But I think you can just basically glance at it type of thing, Edward. I'm sure he'll go over that in more details than I can. Okay, and again, it talks about, as to how working memory, long-term memory, same way, input, output, storage, and which are by all, all of us use computers, so we're familiar with this basically. Okay, and again, this is how complex the brain is type of thing. So this may be worthwhile knowing about. Let me just see if it plays. This I didn't have any sound. I think this is just a microscopic picture of a neuron network, basically. It, what this is basically 1 millimeter section of mouse brain, and that had the complexity of cell. I shall give you the numbers. It had like 20,000 one type of cells called oligodendrocytes, and then glial cells that outnumber the number of neurons. It had like 8,000 vascular cells, means blood vessel related cells, and then others were, about 10,000 neurons, okay, and somewhere, out of which 70% were pyramidal, the so-called master neurons, which conduct the impulse all the way down from your head to your toes, so to speak. And so now imagine if 1 millimeter of mouse brain section, that was the little slide that I just played. Then imagine how many 86 billion neurons will have, each with thousands of connections type of thing. So this was slide from the so-called, a brain modeling project, that was done either the European Blue Brain project or not. So this is, some of the things about the complexity, that we see, how many petabyte type of connections that we are talking about, in the neocortex, okay. So it just goes to show that we'd have a long way before. And this just goes down to the basic, you may remember high school biology class about how the sodium channels open and then the influx takes place, and then the potassium channels open, and then the spikes that goes above the threshold and immediately drops to the baseline. So you can see the interconnectionness. This is old work from 1930s that we talked about, some of the Englishmen's names that we talked about, Edgar Adrian. So he did some of the original work on action potentials, and they fired in all or none phenomenon. But again, it's kind of a neuron is like kids in the class, with repeated stimuli, it stops responding. So after a while, it says, well, that isn't much to it type of thing. Okay. And if you give a stronger stimulus, you get the increased frequency. The neuron just, instead of firing, it fires more noisily type of thing, okay, but doesn't increase the voltage type of thing. So this was like an interpretation of the work that was done, the early pioneering work of the EEG that was done, that was put on a more solid basis, so-called voltage-gated channels, how based on the electrical voltage. So it connects both the things. You can see from this little cartoon diagram as to how when the channels open, the cells, the ions would rush in. See, and this is positive in, negative out, and the same way depolarization, voltage increases, decreases. These are some of the basic slides that you may remember from your high school biology class. And again, this talks about how, and this is important, that how memories, and a German scientist had coined the word called engram as to how the memory is encoded. And this is a Russian neuroscientist, this is linked from his video, and these are his slides as to how memory is encoded in the various regions. Obviously, we talked about hippocampus when we talk about London taxi drivers, amygdala, which is where, the emotional center is, and thalamus, which is the relay center, hypothalamus, which is the hunger and fear center, and the brainstem, which has all the vital organs. So how the memory is encoded. This coded at a multiple level. There are actual physical changes that take place after learning, and it can be reactivated by stimulation. So, and this is, again, a lot of the work was done in rodents, as to how studied by fear conditioning type of thing, as to how the memory is encoded. So this is how there are actually chemical and physical changes that take place, okay. And in search of memory type thing, it's like how memory is encoded. Remember how the Total Recall? It's not as horrid as Arnold Schwarzenegger said in the movie Total Recall, but there are, I think, John should be happy that there are immediate early active genes. Now, these genes are basically related to, I mean, the names are very complicated. These are, now this is, in a way, it's scary that this C-FOS gene, that's actually a proto-oncogene. So it can also, and has also to do with the growth factor. So it has how the cancer and growth are intertwined with each other, while this other gene, ARC, is related to the skeleton of the cells, type thing. So it's related to the long-term potentiation of memory type of thing. So, and this has been well worked out as to how the genetic basis is intertwined with encoding the memory. So this is some of the cutting edge science, that was not just done just in isolated nerve preparation or animal research, or rodents basically. So this was, the really how the voltage gating, the ion flux, how all this intricate circle, it plays in together as to how the genes were transcribed to the proteins, will lead to the ion channels, and then again inside, and then again voltage gated. So how the molecular and genetic basis of memory ties in with the bioelectrical properties. Okay, so that's okay. And then again, this was an interesting video about how varieties of brain may have evolved. We talked about, we always think obviously it's all humans that think, but again, there's a whole category of neural networks that are involved, type of thing, okay. And A are the smaller cells that involve this is, I'm sorry, yeah, this, I'm not going to try to zoom in on it because otherwise I wonder, but someday slides that I have it, it should be in the notes, there's localized cells that connect through various synaptic connections, okay, while B is the middle level, which has neural structure that differ from the more complex brains, okay, type of thing. And there are varieties of this thing. There's a whole legend type of thing as to what type of evolution of brains may have taken place from the single cell organisms to plants to ants. Okay, and so the legend is fairly complicated type of thing, but I think if you have more interest, let's just see if I can zoom in on ants and G and H, type of thing as to how the ants would transmit message. Similarly, Physarium, this is one of those, mold type organisms as to how some of these things it's amazing. There's a video as to how Physarium can find food. It can create network, almost mimics the highway network, so to speak. It will send out, its protoplasm in that direction. Won't find food, it will retract, go back, and it can find the most effective pathway type thing. So those of you who are mathematicians would know that about the 7 bridges of Königsberg. Okay, that's a serious mathematical problem as to how to find the optimal traveling distance, or the so-called traveling salesman problem that gets into the most effective way of finding a solution to a mathematical problem. So the same way, this Physarium, it's almost spooky as to how, say, this little thing, which is like just a bag of protoplasm, based on the chemical signaling, it can find food and create. So this is an interesting way as to how we can just say we are not at the, we may have more intelligence and other stuff, but it is a whole evolutionary basis of intelligence. Okay. Okay, and again, I already emphasized, don't even get into this, please. I think this is an Englishman who is either a Nobel winner or he's absolutely nuts. He's trying to put, the physics and some really complex mathematics into sync as to how organisms and brains would survive. And and he has this whole mathematical thing. And I think even the various experts, it's almost like a quantum theory as to how many people actually understand it. So, but this is, some cutting edge work on neuroscience. And similarly, I think I will leave it to Bruce to talk about von Neumann, who was last he was worked on the Manhattan Project, and he was the founder of the computer science. But at the same time, he was a true polymath. So this was one of his books about computers and the brain. This was published, I think, sometime in the 50s, if I'm not. This was some of his work. So, and he had done research on about pure mathematics, applied mathematics, physics, and also in biology. So that's how I thought that maybe I should at least mention. And there again, and we talked about the chips and this thing. So
we often talk about how traditional computing is reaching its limit. There's a threshold we can't move past without making some seriously big changes to the way we structure computers. One of those exciting ways is by making physical computers a little more like human brains. We introduced this concept in more detail here, but a quick recap: this kind of computing is called neuromorphic computing, which means designing and engineering computer chips that use the same physics of computation used by our own nervous system. This is different from an artificial neural network, which is a program run on a normal computer that mimics the logic of how a human brain thinks. Neuromorphic computing, the hardware version, and neural networks, the software version, can work together because as we make progress in both fields, neuromorphic hardware will probably be the best option to run neural networks on. But for this video, we're going to focus on neuromorphic computing and the really exciting strides that have been made in this field in the past year. See, traditional computers think in binary. Everything is either a 1 or a 0, a yes or a no. You only have two options, so the code we use and the questions we ask these kinds of computers must be structured in a really rigid way. Neuromorphic computing works a little more flexibly. Instead of using an electric signal to mean 1 or 0, the designers of these new chips want to make their computers' neurons talk to each other the way biological neurons do. To do this, you need a kind of precise electric current that flows across a synapse, or the space between neurons. Depending on the number and the kind of ion, the receiving computer neuron is activated in some way, giving you a lot more computational options than just your basic yes and no. This ability to transmit a gradient of understanding from neuron to neuron and have them all working together simultaneously means that neuromorphic chips could eventually be more energy efficient than our normal computers, especially for really complicated tasks. To realize this exciting potential, we need new materials, because what we're using in our computers today isn't going to cut it. The physical properties of something like silicon, for instance, make it hard to control the current between artificial neurons. It just kind of bleeds all over the chip with no organization. So a new design from an MIT team uses different materials: single crystalline silicon and silicon germanium layered on top of one another. Apply an electric field to this new device, and you get a well-controlled flow of ions. A team in Korea is also investigating other materials. They use tantalum oxide to give them precise control over the flow of ions, and it's even more durable. Another team in Colorado is implementing magnets to precisely control the way computer neurons communicate. These advances in the actual architecture of neuromorphic systems are all working towards getting us to a place where the neurons on these chips can learn as they compute. Software neural networks have been able to do this for a while, but it's a relatively new advancement for physical neuromorphic devices. And these experiments are showing promising results. Another leap in performance has been made by a team at the University of Manchester, who have taken a different approach. Their system is called Spinnaker, which stands for Spiking Neural Network Architecture. While other experiments look to change the materials we use, the Manchester team uses traditional digital parts like cores and routers, connecting and communicating with each other in innovative ways. The UK researchers have shown that they can use Spinnaker to simulate the behavior of the human cortex. The hope is that a computer that behaves like a brain will give us enough computing power to simulate something as complicated as the brain, helping us understand diseases like Alzheimer's. Computer chips, perfect computing, which means...
Okay, so you get the idea. Now, these are old ideas that date to 1970s, and this, I remember we talked about Hodgkin and Huxley, and those are the early people who discovered the ion channel and calculated actual equations for the voltage gated channels, everything. So some of these ideas are, there are different types of chips that are created, and there are varieties of complex mathematical equations, so-called partial differential equations, have been used. I think so. But that's some of the more exciting work that is still, and a lot of that work is done at Bruce's former company at IBM and at Stanford type thing. So, okay.
Means design.
Okay, and I think I'm going to skip over some of these slides because of their, right, some of the more, brain-computer interfaces are a lot more interesting. And I think if it will be on the slides that will be there to send out type of thing as to, we talked about how the genome and evolution are interconnected. So I think don't want to belabor and waste time. So some of the more fun videos which are there, which will go over that in the brain-computer interfaces, the earlier use for neuroprosthetic, obviously, that, and people with strokes and spinal cord injuries are the earliest one, uh, that were utilized. And the microelectrodes are implanted into the forearm and reviving into the surviving nerves. And computer transferred the impulses into digital signals, instructing the arm to move. The sensor sends signal, allowing it to move. So this is a standard. This is peripheral nerve, median and ulnar nerves. And this was like a targeted muscle innervation, which is, done under evolution. And this was funded by DARPA because they were interested in the military use type of thing. And a lot of them, now this has gone more from the physical, this thing as to activated, as to it can be controlled with Bluetooth. Some of the surgeries was done, the earliest one, brain-computer interface would have to be dating back to 1957. That has to do with the cochlear implant that can be done in babies as young as 3 months type of thing. And this may, again, that may outlive, that may not be needed with more stem cell implants that are being considered type thing. So, but the cochlear implants have been around for a long time.
Bharat, Peter has his hand up.
Oh yeah, please go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hey, Bharat,
Yeah.
when we're dealing with these neuroprosthetic things, how does medicine get around the problem that the body will encapsulate foreign tissue in a cystic type thing? And
they use metal that is inert. It's just like, for pacemaker wires, we could have a pacemaker wire for a long time. So that's, so I think they use an alloy, which is, obviously not, because we've been using pacemakers for, they don't develop, and some of them, obviously these are new enough that we may not have seen a long-term problems, type thing. So, but again, the good examples from my experience, I can say, well, pacemaker wires, don't have too much testing. The leads can be there type of thing. It can develop sometimes fracture, but they use the real alloy material, which is biologically inert type of thing, Okay, so I think hopefully that, makes sense. And now this is an interesting thing. I think a lot of these are now videos type of thing. So I think let's. Oh, okay.
It's not actual vision. It's what they call artificial vision.
Every day, Anthony Andriatola puts on his gear, leaves his Medford home, and rides the T to his job in downtown Crossing. Anthony has retinitis pigmentosa. He began to lose his vision in his teens.
Once everything is black, for many, many years, that was it.
For 20 years, he lived in darkness until he became one of the first to receive a bionic eye. This animation from the developer shows how it works. A tiny camera in the glasses sends images to a wearable computer. The images are processed and sent wirelessly to an implant on the eye.
I don't see things the way other people do. I see everything in different flashes, lights, shapes.
It's more of a cloudy black and white vision.
I can tell the difference between a car or a bus or a truck. I can't tell you what make the car is.
That helps him navigate life more safely.
I'm going by Rhodes Brothers, and I can see that they have some tables set up, and this is really a difficult place to navigate because there's always a lot of people and things change all the time. And here we are at St. Anthony's.
And after his journey, he arrives at his job as a substance abuse counselor at St. Anthony's Shrine.
I have my hope back. Once I lost my sight, I was resigned to be blind for the rest of my life. I'm not resigned to that anymore. I believe if I can live long enough, I'll be able to see a lot of beautiful things.
Okay, so this is one of the older videos type thing. So Okay, now let's see what else we have. Okay, I'm sorry, I should go forward. Come on now.
It's not actual vision, it's what they call artificial vision.
Every day.
Okay, this is, okay, now.
Tremors, essential tremors. I had this hand done last year. When I first started noticing any tremors, this was about maybe 12 years ago, but I didn't really pay much attention to it. You just kind of dismiss. I'll work around it, but it continually got worse.
Deep brain stimulation is a brain pacemaker. In our brain, when we have certain diseases, the signals, the electrical signals traveling around the brain become disordered. A little bit like when an orchestra is first tuning and everyone is kind of playing whatever they want to play. What deep brain stimulation does is it provides a regular set of electrical impulses that kind of drown out that noise and let the natural impulses go through. So whether it's Parkinson's disease or tremor, deep brain stimulation helps with the symptoms by getting rid of the bad or disordered signals that are traveling in the brain.
This may sound funny, and this is why I'm having my left hand done as well. If you ever tried to cut a piece of steak on a plate, at first it started just, I'll get this piece over here or something like that. Cut a piece of steak on a plate, and it's, I'll chase it over. I'll chase it over here. I was chasing a damn steak all over the place, just to cut a little tiny piece. And this is what it's all about. It's just horrible to be able to maneuver like this here.
How are you doing, my friend? Good. Look like y'all got hope in it. Good.
Deep brain stimulation surgery occurs in two stages. The first stage is the placement of the electrodes very precisely into the brain, and the second stage is the placement of the implantable pulse generator, which we call the battery.
Feel something in your hand? What did you feel?
At the University of Michigan, most often deep brain stimulation is done awake. The reason for this is that it's absolutely critical that we know that we're in exactly the right spot. Even in the same disease, different patients' brains are different. By having the patient awake in the operating room, there's an opportunity for Dr. Chu and Karen Kluin, our speech pathologist, to rigorously test the patient and make sure for that patient, the lead is in exactly the right spot.
Excellent. As fast as you can. Go.
Huckleberry, 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 huckleberry.
Perfect. You can stop. We did 7 huckleberries in 5 seconds. You're doing okay.
Yeah, I'm sure. Do you know if your place in Florida is okay?
As far as I know,
Yeah.
I think I still have a roof.
Okay. All
Yes,
right.
that's it.
Today is my first visit with Dr. Chu to have my settings made.
So when we test them, you can turn on the simulator and you can see a tremor basically melt away almost immediately once you get the right setting. And it's actually one of the best things in the world to see someone shaking around when they're holding the cup, and then you turn it on and just a few seconds afterwards that tremor goes away and they're able to take a cup from a table and then bring it to their mouth and be able to drink from it without spilling. It's one of the best things I think you could ever see in the world.
We went through the different levels. Just holding my hand.
Okay, so you get the idea. Now this is, I think I'm going to skip this because it's a 10-minute video from The Economist. I think otherwise we won't have enough time. I'm just adding up my time. If I have time later on, I'll come back to this one. Okay, but I think, this was, obviously they do a nice videos, but I think it's almost 10 minutes. And now, was everybody able to understand it when I paid it at a faster speed? Because, and otherwise I have like a 5, 10. And yeah, no, I think we should be in time. We should be able to find, but I'll skip this one. I can come back to this later on, type thing, because the other ones, which I would love to see, are the ones on organoids that are more interesting. Okay, and now this is the, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this one. Okay, have everybody heard the word Neuralink? Elon Musk company. Okay, all right. This was, this is. Again, you have to give credit to the man that their chips are really phenomenal and cutting edge, basically. There is an electron chip, which is called Utah Array, which has 100 electrodes that are, while this one has 100,000, which are 24 microns, and it is inserted with robotic surgery. So you can just see how much communication and how many nerves you can talk about, type of thing. And so this is And so this has huge number of electrodes and this thing, and so the connectivity is going to be phenomenal type of thing. And I have some videos afterwards on it. Let me see if I can find it later on. And this is another company that is doing a similar work, which is worthwhile seeing.
This device is made to be inserted into the brain, allowing people living with paralysis to control their phones, computers, and beyond using only their thoughts.
I can talk to you with my thoughts.
We visited Synchron, the company developing this technology, to learn about how it works, how it gets into the brain without open brain surgery, and what it's like to use. Let's check it out. The dream of controlling computers with brainwaves, known as a brain-computer interface, or BCI for short, has been around for decades. So far, most of these technologies have primarily stayed within the domain of clinical trials and studies, especially when it comes to devices that are actually implanted inside the skull itself. Synchron aims to change that.
Synchron is bringing electronics into the brain in a minimally invasive way, and it's going to be useful for brain-computer interfaces, for brain monitoring, for brain mapping, and for brain stimulation.
Synchron says it's been able to get around the need for open brain surgery by building off of stents and catheters, pre-existing medical devices that enter the body via the blood vessels.
We enter into the jugular vein in the neck, make our way up into the brain, and then the stent opens up over that area of the brain called the motor cortex, and it communicates wirelessly with the outside world to control personal devices.
The resulting implant is called a stentrode, and the full system is called the Synchron switch. Oxley demonstrated the insertion for us on a model brain used for training by doctors before they go on to perform the procedure on human beings.
So I'm just going to open this, and then this is going to go up through the jugular vein, up into the brain. Now we deploy the device.
Tom said that the prevalence of cath labs, places where catheter-based procedures occur, creates a good jumping off point for the stentrode to become a more widely accessible medical device.
Our philosophy for a BCI to be successful for a large number of people, to be scalable, is that it had to be simple. And one way to do that is to really simplify what you're looking for in the brain patterns. And in the part of the brain that we're in, there are aggregations of activity that represent attempted movement.
The antennas inside the stentrode pick up the signals inside the brain, and the Synchron switch transmits them wirelessly to perform the desired action.
The simplest elements of control are point and click.
Stare at it and think about moving for a long time, and it'll start zooming in. Yeah, and release. So you made a click, your first click with your brain.
You're going to see videos of our patients using iOS to send health reports, to do text messaging, in combination with other accessibility platforms like eye tracking. Getting back your ability to control a personal device can be hugely empowering.
Like a traditional stent, the stentrode is made to remain inside the body indefinitely.
The biggest risk of the procedure is that there can be a blood clot that forms inside the device when it's sitting inside the blood vessel. But what happens over about a 90-day period, cells grow over the device and it incorporates into the wall of the blood vessel kind of like a tattoo. From that point on, the risk of blood clotting is much lower, but patients are still staying on aspirin after the device has been inserted.
A common concern when dealing with any sort of internet-connected device is privacy, let alone a device that can listen to and interpret your thoughts.
The privacy concerns are real. If there was to be a privacy leak, at worst it would be able to predict as a corollary the way that you were, say, moving your mouse on a screen. And there's a history of other implanted devices like cardiac pacemakers and cochlear hearing devices that also have privacy concerns. So in this field, it's highly regulated and we work with the FDA to meet.
Okay, so you get the idea. And now I think what I ran into is the first US patient in paralysis trial was enrolled by these people type thing. A guy named, there was a name, but it's immaterial to talk about.
Very high standards.
The 10th patient to receive the Synchron switch implant.
Oops. Okay, now this was a worthwhile video. Obviously, nature always does a great job type thing, so I think this is worth playing.
For years, scientists have been developing systems to allow people who can't speak to communicate with their minds. These brain-computer interfaces attempt to translate patterns of brain activity into words and sentences. Back in 2021, this was the state of the art. A setup that allowed this participant to talk at a rate of 15 words per minute with a vocabulary of 50 words. 2 years later, a pair of teams have made rapid progress. The new studies show off systems that enable their two participants to speak at over 60 words per minute, with comparatively fewer errors and larger vocabularies than ever before. This research could be the groundwork needed to take brain-computer interfaces like these out of the lab and start developing practical and potentially life-changing technology. This is Pat. She has ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which impairs her speech and facial movements. And she's been working with a team of neuroscientists based at Stanford University to help develop their brain-computer interface. When Pat tries to speak, the neurons in her speech motor cortex activate. This is the part of the brain that controls the muscles we use to speak. A series of microelectrode arrays inserted into Pat's brain can read the activity of over 100 individual neurons. These readouts then go into a machine learning algorithm. During training sessions, Pat tries to read out specific phrases. And the algorithm learns to match the sounds she's reading with the patterns of neuronal activity. This data is then fed into a language model with a vocabulary of over 100,000 words, which figures out what words those sounds are most likely to represent.
How do you like my music?
After training, Pat could communicate at around 62 words per minute, much faster than previous setups, and with a much larger vocabulary and fewer mistakes.
Hello, how are you?
The researchers say that using more electrodes, reading activity from more individual neurons, could make their system more accurate and provide even more information about how different parts of the brain actually work. Meanwhile, a second team from the University of California, San Francisco are tackling this challenge with a slightly different approach. Their system reads brain activity from the surface of the brain and again can use a combination of a machine learning algorithm and a language model to decode that brain activity successfully into text, with a vocabulary of around 1,000 words or so and a rate of up to 78 words per minute. But as well as producing text, this system can produce the sounds of speech, spoken by this moving avatar.
Do not be afraid to ask me questions.
The avatar isn't just reading out the decoded text. Instead, another algorithm has been trained to translate brain activity directly into sounds.
Great to see you again.
The idea is that this speech isn't limited to certain words and could potentially allow someone to vary the tone and speed of their speech in a much more natural way.
As soon as possible.
The team also experimented with making the avatar face respond to motor signals to produce certain expressions. Combining all these elements together could one day give people who can't speak the ability to communicate with much more nuance than is possible with text alone.
What do you think of my artificial voice?
Despite these advances, the two systems still have about a 25% error rate, and they speak at around half the average speed for English speech. As well as that, each of these systems has so far only been tested with one person, and we still don't know exactly what the safest and most accurate way of getting the most relevant brain signals might be. Still, this leap forward in the speed, accuracy, and vocabulary could be enough to show that a mass-produced product is feasible. It could be enough to start developing safe and practical hardware that's long-lasting and easy for people to use in their everyday lives. The next question is what the people who need it actually want from these kinds of systems, and how best to turn scientific progress on brain-computer interfaces like these into usable technology that can improve the lives of people around the world.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you, Pat.
Okay, I think we could move on to the next one. Okay, this is, I think there are two of this thing, but I think this one is a better one of the two. Must.
Elon Musk's brain chip startup Neuralink says it has received approval to begin recruiting patients for its first human trial. An independent review board has given the green light for the company to seek people with paralysis to test its experimental device in a 6-year study. The study will use a robot to surgically place a brain-computer interface, or BCI, implant in a region of the brain that controls the intention to move. Neuralink says the initial goal is to enable people to control a computer cursor or keyboard using their thoughts alone. Musk has grand ambitions for this medical device company, saying it would facilitate speedy surgical insertions of its chip devices to treat conditions like obesity, autism, depression, and schizophrenia.
The first two applications we're going to aim for in humans are restoring vision, and I think this is like notable in that even if someone has never had vision ever, like they were born blind, we believe we can still restore vision. And then the other application being in the motor cortex, where we would initially enable someone who has almost no ability to operate their muscles, and enable them to operate their phone faster than someone who has working hands.
In May, the company said it had received clearance from the US Food and Drug Administration for its first in-human clinical trial. Its previous testing in animals is under federal scrutiny for potential animal welfare violations.
Okay, so you get the idea. This second one, which shows the experimental things, but I think for sake of time, I shan't go into it.
Elon Musk's brain implant company Neuralink said on Thursday it had been given a green light from the US FDA to kickstart its first in-human clinical study.
Oh, I have to stop it. Sorry. Oh yeah, I think we are on the next one. I think this one is more about robots type of thing, and it's a spooky video, and I think it's almost like a 12-minute long. So let's jump on to the next one, which is on organoids, which is what more germane to our my title.
Japan is a pioneer in robotic research.
Yeah,
there, I got to know one of the world's top roboticists and his mind-blowing creations. Our topic today on...
Okay, let's stop it. And
Japan is a pioneer in robotic research. There, I got to know one of the world's...
Okay, where is this? Where is it? Organoids, organoids. Come on now. I know it's there. Okay. Yeah, this is a okay, I think they have another one, which is cerebral organoids, which are made from stem cells, which are called pluripotent cells, and brain into a dish, basically. Okay. And it's used for drug testing, disease models, and genomic analysis. Okay. So it has varieties of uses type thing. Okay. And what I've shown is that a team from Australia has said that they are aware of themselves, sentient. An Australian team, it showed about 800,000 brain cells, which is just a drop, very minuscule amount, in a dish can perform goal-oriented task. Okay, and this is spooky. Okay, and now this was interesting that they don't have any blood vessels, but still not, and they're not all types of cells. So it's a very, very early work. But again, you can just see that this is, and they put varieties of chemicals, which is a protein with certain chemicals and enzymes that are put, and these are brain cells that were derived from stem cells. So they're able to wake up the brain cells that were there. And you can just see that they are showing some preliminary, Okay, I'm sorry. Let's go forward. Okay, and okay, and this is one about the virtual brain. Hopefully, that will play. I think
Epilepsy is a brain disease involving recurrent, unprovoked, and excessive neuronal activity. We call this type of activity seizures. It is the fourth most common neurological disorders, affecting about 1% of the human population. No, there is no cure to epilepsy. About 2/3 of the patients we can treat with medication. All the other, they are candidate for interventions such as stimulation or surgery. In order to do this, we need to know the precise localization of the affected brain regions, the so-called epileptogenic zone.
The process to locate the epileptogenic zone starts with the stereotactic electroencephalography, the so-called SEEG, that records neural activity directly in the brain. Comparing the empirical brain signals to a range of simulations can narrow down the potentially affected regions of the brain. The current state-of-the-art model is the virtual brain. It's a personalized computational model where brain regions are reduced to point-like nodes in a network, discarding their orientations. A mathematical model is attached to each node. Additionally, the brain's complex connectivity is derived from the patient's MR images. In the virtual brain, the neural activity recorded by the SEEG electrodes is expressed as a function of the distance to the point sources of the network. While this approach helps to narrow down the affected regions, the low spatial resolution and loss of orientation of the neural sources limits the precision in identifying the epileptogenic zone. In e-brains, more powerful computers and the integration of highly heterogeneous data enables a new approach, the virtual big brain. Some of the data comes directly from the patient, and some is high-resolution data from post-mortem brains. But instead of reducing the brain regions to a network of point-like nodes, we can create high-resolution surfaces for the cortex and subcortex. The brain's multi-scale connectivity is integrated into a high-resolution mesh of more than 200,000 vertices spanned in 3 dimensions. All the vertices of the mesh are equipped with mathematical models of neuronal populations. Intracortical fibers, short-range U fibers, and long-range corticocortical fibers connect neuronal populations in the same mesh. The model is supplemented by dipole moments. They are mimicking the alignment of the pyramidal neurons, which are also perpendicular to the surface. The SEEG can now be simulated using distance and orientation of the sources. This was not possible before. The simulated activities are not constrained to network nodes anymore. They can propagate across the brain surface. Researchers can simulate countless epileptic seizures in e-brains using the virtual big brain. The application of deep learning and Bayesian inference finds the parameter configuration that most closely matches the patient's own SEEG recordings. This is an important step towards pinpointing the epileptogenic zone with greater precision.
Okay, so you get the idea. So this is some cutting edge technology. Okay, and again, this last but not the least, there are some really off the wall people called, who are becoming cyborg, and they've implanted chips voluntarily. And this is, so again, some very futuristic type of thing, as to like how brain-body interfaces. These are some of the references that I had used. I think I mentioned some of them. This is Anil Seth, who did talk on consciousness, this recent book about minds. And this is again about the ethical issues type of thing. And this is, you already got the video about Matthew Cobb. And so I think, so this is basically, we're almost on time type thing. So let's see what else I have. And I think, yeah, that's basically a type of thing. So I think I should stop here and probably stick by for some of the slides are on AI, but I think I'm sure Bruce will talk more about it type of thing. So, and there was another one this morning on organoids, but I think I will have to send that out because otherwise we're going to run out of time. I will stop here if you don't mind stopping the recording, and then I'll step around for questions, comments, advice, what have you.